I've been an attorney for a little over 25 years, and most of my work is in the area of Endangered Species Act, water rights, and working with farmers, irrigators, and irrigation districts. I think I'm going to have kind of the first part of this presentation, but just so you've got to know the panelists, maybe start with Marty, if you want to just introduce yourself and say a couple things.
Hi, I'm Marty Vaughn. I'm a wildlife biologist. I've spent most of my career, about 40 years, dealing with endangered species. The last 30, almost entirely with preparation of HCPs in Washington and Oregon, and been working on the Deschutes HCPs since 2010.
And Bridget?
Good afternoon, everybody. Bridget Moran. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm the Field Supervisor for our office. We have a group of 10 biologists that work on species management issues here in Central Oregon. And I was thinking earlier today, I think this is my 4th or 5th farm fair, and I apologize for not being there in person. We're still under pretty strict COVID restrictions for our office, but pleasure to be here today.
Thanks, Marty and Bridget. So I think, like I said, I'll kind of, as Josh said, give just a little bit of history as to how we got here. I've been working with the Deschutes Basin Board of Control, the 8 districts that make up that Board of Control in North Unit on these ESA issues for about the last 15 years. And I know that the district patrons and community members and others have had a lot of questions about the HCP, and we hope to answer those today. We did get a few questions from North Unit's patrons that we will get to today. Very good questions, and I think will make for a good conversation. I wanted to start just because if you pick up the HCP and you just looked at that in a vacuum, I'm pretty sure it'd be confusing and overwhelming, and lots of questions about, how did we get here and how did we end up here? And so we have a good 90 minutes today, and so while many of you have been part of this process, close to this process for the last 15 years, I know that there are some where this is new, and it maybe appeared as if it came out of the blue over the last few months or the last year, and I can assure you that was not the case. So just to kind of launch in, very quickly, 1 minute, very high level summary. The Endangered Species Act is pretty much the most powerful environmental statute that Congress has ever passed. The key provisions are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for terrestrial species and the National Marine Fisheries Service for aquatic species that live in the ocean or go back and forth to the ocean, anadromous species. They come up with a process whereby, thank you, Josh, they will evaluate whether to list a species, and if it warrants listing, it comes in as either threatened or endangered. And if it is listed, then there are several different sections of the Endangered Species Act that come into play. The one that is kind of the trigger is known as Section 9. It's the prohibition on take. And it says that even if you are engaged in an otherwise legal activity, if you take, which means essentially harm, kill, modify, adversely modify habitat, then you are liable for having harmed that listed species. And if you're found guilty of that, it's $25,000 per violation, and it's up to a year in prison for every violation you have. So the Act also includes a couple of ways to deal with the fact that if you're engaged in an otherwise legal activity, such as exercising your water rights, that you can get coverage or basically authorization to legally take or harm or kill those listed species. And so for federal agencies, they go through a process that's under Section 7 of the Act. Under that, they go through a process where they have to prove that whatever federal action that they're undertaking, it will not jeopardize the continued existence of the listed species. And so they'll put together a biological assessment. The services, Fish and Wildlife or National Marine Fisheries Service, will come back with a biological opinion as to whether or not their actions and proposed mitigation are okay to go forward and not going to jeopardize the continued existence of the species. And if they succeed in that, they get an incidental take statement, which again authorizes the federal agency to take or harm or kill listed species. Meanwhile, for non-federal agencies, which would include irrigation districts, private property owners, anybody, cities, they can pursue a permit under Section 10 of the Act. And under Section 10, to get the authorization to legally harm or take or kill a listed species, you have to put together a habitat conservation plan. There are standards as to what that plan has to do and what it has to meet. And if it passes muster with the services and they approve it, then they will give you an incidental take permit. And that permit authorizes you to, again, kill listed species. And if you don't have the permit, like I say, it's $25,000 per violation and up to a year in prison. So that's the background. Here in the Deschutes Basin, winding back to kind of the early 2000s, it's when it all started. And the triggering event, and again, I'm just going to kind of put this out there, and I know we're being recorded, and so some of what I say may not agree with, but it's just kind of I guess the view of how we got here. This all started with PGE's relicensing of the Pelton Round Butte project, and so what that means is PGE had a license from FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to own and operate, or I guess operate that project, and that project has impacts to wildlife. And so when the term of the license usually runs 30, 40, 50 years. And so that license term was coming up, and they went to FERC and said, we'd like to renew the license. And FERC, as well as environmental groups, tribes, and others said, not so fast. This project extirpated or caused the extinction of certain fish species, anadromous fish species, above the project, above Pelton Round Butte. And so as part of the mitigation to get the new license, you're going to need to do a lot. And one of the things, in addition to a $100 million tower, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that was built to try to control water temperature below the project. Another huge aspect was, as part of that, was to reintroduce Mid-Columbia River steelhead above the project. So it had been there before the project. If they wanted a license to continue to operate, they had to put them back. And at the time that they proposed that or agreed to that, the hatchery stock that PGE was going to use was not listed under the Endangered Species Act. It was a hatchery stock, artificially propagated, and the plan was to plop them down in the Crooked River and the Metolius and parts of the Deschutes and move forward. Well, that kind of all started. And in the middle of that, there was litigation that had been brought by the Pacific Legal Foundation, which is a group kind of headquartered out of California that oftentimes will take property owners' side of things. And they made the argument that and again, this was in the early 2000s, all of the salmon, steelhead, anadromous fish listings, there wasn't a good basis for that because if you counted the hatchery stocks, then there were plenty of fish. They weren't nearly as the population numbers weren't nearly as threatened or endangered as might otherwise suspect. So they sued and brought a lawsuit to say, let's count the hatchery fish. And when you do that, then all of these different stocks and species would be delisted. Well, that case, called the Alsea Valley case, kind of out of Oregon District Court and up from there, it agreed with Pacific Legal Foundation and said, yeah, you're right. Genetically, for different purposes, we should count the hatchery stocks as part of the populations. But when we count them, that doesn't mean that we're going to delist. That just means we're going to include the hatchery stocks as part of the listed populations. And so now, Section 9, the prohibition on take, not only applies to the wild salmon steelhead, but it also applies to the hatchery stocks. So as soon as PGE and the tribes then began to implement their reintroduction program, and they were plopping down the baby fish up above the project, then suddenly the districts were in a spot where even if they were engaged in an otherwise legal activity of diverting water, storing water, managing water, if that resulted in the take of one of the hatchery fish, they were on the hook for fines and prison, potential prison. So at that point in time, again, this is back in kind of the mid to late 2000s, the districts kind of got together and said, we have a choice. We have some options. One of the options was to put out an all-out legal challenge and battle with PGE and quite frankly, the tribes. And so part of, just take a pause, part of the way that PGE got the project relicensed was that they included the tribes as part owners of the project. Otherwise, the tribes, and again, part of this is conjecture on my part, I don't have any inside knowledge or anything like that, but my sense was the tribes were not in favor of that project, or they were certainly in favor of a lot of mitigation. You look at pretty much any other basin in Oregon, the Pacific Northwest, or the West, where the tribes don't have an interest in the hydro project, they're almost universally opposed. So down in Klamath, the Klamath tribes have been all about getting the Klamath dams out. On the Columbia River, Snake River dams, the tribes have been all about getting the dams out. And here, of course, when the tribes took on an ownership interest, things changed. Quick update, it was, there was an article in the Portland Business Journal last week. Under the agreement, the tribes had an option that they could exercise to increase their ownership in the project, and they just did that, and now they own 49% of the Pelton Round Butte project. I think in year 2034, they have another option to go to 51%. And suddenly they're going to be, you know, if they do that, they'll have the majority stake. So our option at the time was to go fight them and say, don't do this. Or the other option was to try and make it work. And in the meantime, I just say that the other context there, we were all here in the basin looking at Klamath. And in 2001, I think as everybody is well aware, water got shut off. There's been a fight about it ever since. 20 years later, they still don't have water. I was at a meeting for the Oregon Water Resources Congress, which is the trade association that represents all the irrigation districts in Oregon last week. And a couple of the district guys from Klamath were there, and they said, probably not getting water. They didn't get water last year. They're probably not going to get water this year, even if their snowpack, which is low, gets up to 40%. You know, in the past, that would have been an okay water year. They'd get something. Now with 40% snowpack, they get zero. And part of the reason they get zero is because they don't have an HCP, they don't have a permit. We'll get into a little bit more of the detail later, but they've kind of left it up to reclamation to look out for endangered species, and reclamation didn't do them any favors. So at that time, the districts got together and we went up and we had a meeting with a fellow named Bob Lawn. Bob was the regional administrator for NIMFS up in Seattle. This was during the George Bush administration. And we said, you know, we've got a problem. You are putting listed fish around the diversions, and it, you know, it's not going to work. And as part of that, I guess I should also say that the districts in the basin, through the DRC, through PGE's Pelton Fund, and otherwise, we're all receiving money to begin to modernize their systems, pipe ditches, try to conserve water, and so it also set up this dynamic where if we were going to throw, you know, a nuclear hand grenade in, we were probably going to be in court for years without, you know, a lot of the support that we'd enjoyed in the past. So as a result of that meeting, we kind of came up with a plan that Bob had agreed to, and that plan had three different pieces to it. One, first thing out of the gate was Bob issued the districts letters of prosecutorial discretion, which basically meant that even if the district's activities were resulting in take of fish that were now listed, and it wasn't only the Mid-Columbia River steelhead, bull trout, you know, had been listed as well. The NIMFS agreed that they weren't going to come after the districts, which was good and helpful, and it was really one of the first times that the agency had ever done that. But those letters couldn't protect us from third parties, because under the Endangered Species Act, not only can the services come after a violator of the act, but third parties, environmental groups, under Section 11 can bring citizen suits, and they can sue on their own, and we'll come back to that because that happened in this basin too. The second part of the path forward was that NIMFS agreed that they would promulgate what's known as a 10J rule, and what that, under Section 10J of the Endangered Species Act, we can designate, or the NIMFS could designate, the reintroduced fish above the project as experimental. The advantage of that is that the Section 9 take prohibition would not apply. And so it gave us some breathing room, at least with respect to steelhead. But you know, that second step was dependent on the districts moving forward to complete a long-term HCP that would provide coverage on a much longer-term basis. And then the third part of the plan was, with the prosecutorial discretion letters issued, with the 10J rule in place, and then the last part was to finish the HCP, which would then result in the install take permit. So we set about our work. That kind of teed off, like Marty said, I think about 12, 13 years ago. And I want to say that a large part of that work, especially the scientific work, was largely paid for by the federal government through Section 4, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grants. There was a lot of studies that had to be done to understand the baseline, to understand the effects of the district activities, and then what some of the options might be. Midway through that effort, and this was under the Obama administration, so we've shifted administrations since when we started, a national environmental group, organization, Center for Biological Diversity, they sued the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for having failed to list the Oregon spotted frog. And we were aware of the frog, it hadn't been listed, but whenever you do an HCP, you not only look at the species that are listed at the time, but you also look at the species that could be listed in the foreseeable future. And so when CBD sued, the Obama administration turned around and settled and basically agreed that they would proceed with a process to kind of get off the status reviews and take a hard look at whether to list, which then resulted in the listing. Almost immediately following that, the Center for Biological Diversity, once they had the listing in place, then sued the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation because we now had a listed species, the frogs, and we had federal activities in the basin, included the ownership and some of the operation of the federal reservoirs, which include Wikia and Crane Prairie and Crescent. They said, you don't have a Section 7 incidental take authorization or statement, so you're in violation of the act. And then almost immediately after that, Water Watch of Oregon, a state-based group, they also sued Reclamation and added in the districts. So Arnold, Lone Pine, North Unit, Central Oregon, and Tumalo were all kind of wrapped into that litigation. Out of the box, as soon as they got it filed, one of the first things they did was to seek a preliminary injunction. So they filed a motion for a preliminary injunction, and that was right at the start of the season in 2015. And what they asked for was for Crane Prairie, Wikia, and Crescent to basically be shut down for all irrigation purposes, and instead to be managed solely for Oregon spotted frogs. So then we came in to defend that lawsuit. It was, we had to hire experts and get expert testimony in order to put together our depositions and on and on. A number of you were actually in the hearing over in Eugene when that was heard by in federal court. And the court ruled in the district's favor and said, we're not going to shut them down. Part of the reason, I'll tell you, that I feel like we were successful in that is that we had both the Fish and Wildlife Service on our side in that litigation because of all the work that we'd been doing on the HCP and the fact that we weren't just sitting on our hands doing nothing. Also, we had the Confederate Tribes of the Warm Springs on our side as well. And that's because during the HCP process, we were very much included them. Again, as we just talked about, they have an ownership interest in Pelt and Round Butte. And obviously the fish species, part of the reintroduction there, very important for not only the FERC license, but also their cultural resource interests as well. So the motion was defeated, but that didn't mean that the litigation was over. That just meant that they didn't get preliminary injunctive relief while the rest of the case went forward. So they were still free then to continue to litigate to see whether or not there would be injunctive relief at the back end of the lawsuit or damages or whatever else that they might claim. Rather than continue to litigate that out, we settled it. And as part of the settlement, the only thing that the districts agreed to do was the same thing that we'd agreed to from the get-go, which was we would work on long-term ESA compliance, which was the HCP and the ITP. The Fish and Wildlife Service, they were not a party, but Bureau of Reclamation was, of course. And the Bureau of Reclamation also settled, and the only thing that they really agreed to do was to pay the attorney's fees for the plaintiffs. The districts did not pay any of the plaintiffs' attorney's fees. We'd kind of drawn a line and said that we weren't going to do that. So with that done, and we had to do an interim Section 7 for the Bureau piece, we kind of got back to work, and then slowly and deliberately, 5 years forward from that, studies, conservation measures, National Environmental Policy Act compliance, negotiated back and forth to reach to an HCP that then resulted in the ITP that issued at the end of, issued a year ago. And we're going to get into more detail about it, but the long and short of it is it's a 30-year permit. It kind of works like a contract. So if we do what we say we're going to do, they can't ask us to do more. They're not going to tell us to do less. It's kind of a contract. and it provides us protection. Probably the most important feature for North Unit was it includes time, at least 7 years and maybe more depending on how things play out, where the winter releases are very minimal. They're 100 CFS, and it's actually less than that because even before any of this started, there were in-stream water rights that it guaranteed at least 21.6 CFS. So we're talking about 79 CFS that was added on to that. And that's it in terms of the winter flows. Now, obviously, it ramps up over time, but the whole purpose for that was to buy time to conserve water in some of the other districts to make that available to North Unit in order to get everybody the water they need. I think as everybody knows, 2021 was the worst year, and then we had an awful drought. I'm almost done with the summary, and I apologize to my co-panelists for taking up the first part of this. One really important thing that I think gets overlooked, while we were doing the HCP and trying to get to the ITP, there was a parallel process that reclamation had to go through under Section 7. Because regardless of whether or not we got the ITP and finished the HCP, Bureau of Reclamation still needed its own ESA compliance coverage, which happens during Section 7. So they were preparing their own BA. The biological opinion that was issued by Fish and Wildlife Service covered not only our activities, but their activities as well. And that did result in an incidental take statement for them. Very significantly, and it's part of the reason we went down the HCP path in the first place, was that we wanted to be able for the districts to control their own destiny. If the districts weren't going to play and were going to sit on the sidelines and wait for reclamation to go, we would not have gotten to the same endpoint that we got to. And if you look at Klamath, it's kind of what happened. The districts there, I know that they've tried to settle and do some things in the past, but they don't have an HCP, they didn't play. So the ESA compliance and everything that's run down in Klamath is run through Section 7, and it's run by reclamation. And quite frankly, the districts not only have to fend off environmental groups, tribes, but they're also at war really with reclamation as well. And so part of our concern is that if you just leave it to Section 7, there's a chance you're going to get run over, and then you're kind of playing defense as opposed to trying to get out in front. The thing that happened in our basin was that reclamation agreed to let us get out in front, and they didn't add on any additional requirements. It's basically their Section 7 is to work with the districts and implement what the districts committed to. And so even though there are two layers, I bring that up because there's been talk about, can we just reject the HCP and go away, and won't we be fine? We'll just go to court and win. Case law is pretty good, or I shouldn't say good. Case law is fairly consistent that the ESA trumps state water rights. And B, even if we were to win somewhere in that mix, reclamation's still going to be doing their own thing. And then at that point, we kind of lose control over a lot of that. I think that that kind of covers the why and how, and if you just did a search on the internet and you came up with the HCP, kind of what's going on here, that I hope gives you a little bit of background. Like I mentioned, I guess the last thing I just say about Klamath, they've lost repeatedly on ESA versus water rights, and so their fallback position was to kind of go the Fifth Amendment takings route under the U.S. Constitution as well as the state constitution. And we participated my firm participated in an amicus brief to the U.S. Supreme Court to try to get them to take that case in favor of the takings, and the Supreme Court rejected it and said, nope, if water is taken for ESA under the contracts and whatnot that they had there's no compensation. So in many ways, the argument was to say, look, it's no different than land, and if the government comes and says we need your land for highway, they can kind of do it, eminent domain, but they got to reimburse you. So we made the same argument. The districts have been making that same argument for 20 years, and here we are in 2022, and there's no water, there's no deal, and they're still in court, and so that was kind of the framework for comparison. So I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer a few questions now about any of that, or we can kind of get into, for the next, we have an hour, 57 minutes, we can get into some of the questions that came in to the district as well. So And I should probably pause too, following my speech there. If Bridget or Marty want to add anything to that, or Bridget wants to disagree with me about any of that, that's certainly fair. But so maybe we'll just pause. I don't see any hands here in the room. Bridget, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think you summarized that well. I would just say that that is a tremendous amount of information for people to absorb, and I'll just offer that I remain open and available to talk to anybody one-on-one that wants to understand each of those steps maybe a little bit slower, because 15 or 20 years of ESA law and water law was probably a lot to digest at once. So, but I think that the foundation there is that there's legal precedent for why the districts wanted to design their own, be in control of their own situation, and I think you summarized it well.
Yeah, I would agree with Bridget. I think it was a great summary, David. And it is a lot of information, a lot of tech talk, really legal news. I would encourage anyone in the room, if there was any particular aspect of that didn't make sense or that went too fast, go ahead and raise your hand. And Dave, we'd love to give you another 15 minutes on it.
Sure. Yes, and again, I don't want to speak for the Pacific Legal Foundation. They're very helpful, like I say, to a lot of water users, but that was not the outcome that they were hoping for. What they were hoping for in that case was to say, if you counted hatchery as part of the overall population with the wild numbers, because originally the listings were done based on the wild numbers, wild fish numbers, and their argument was if you include hatchery, well then there's millions, billions more, and the court then agreed with them, and I think what Pacific Legal Foundation was hoping for was to say, okay, well then populations are great, not a problem. Instead, the court said, we agree with you, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to be listed. It just means now the listing includes the hatchery, which then is what really teed off the whole process here. So good question. And the case is Alsea Valley, and you can find it on the internet, and it's a read, sad read in some ways. So, any other questions? If not, maybe I'll serve just a little bit as the moderator, since I've got all the questions that are kind of that have been asked, and a number of these are scientific questions, and so probably better.
Dave?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
I just wanted to add something to what you just said. I think that the importance of that whole discussion about the attempt to delist the steelhead is not just pertinent to steelhead in the Deschutes, but it's pertinent to the question of delisting in general. I think it's just one of many examples of attempts to delist species that failed. The reason that they fail more often than not is because I think the service actually gets sued more often for not listing species that meet the federal criteria as threatened and endangered. They're while it may not seem like it, they're pretty cautious and deliberate about the listing process. They don't just arbitrarily put species on because they think they might need some protection. So they go through a pretty rigorous process to list a species. There's always a lot of, concern when something gets listed. Obviously, a lot of them have a big economic impact. I worked on the spot owl listings for several years, and there were a lot of attempts to downgrade them or delist them. And the fact of the matter is that they warrant the listing. It's not going to, and I think the same is relevant for the spotted frog. I know that question has come up, and it may come up today, but the prospects for delisting the spotted frog are pretty slim. It warrants listing. It meets the federal criteria, and I think it would be unsuccessful to delist it.
All right, and if there are no other questions, we're going to jump into some of the specific questions about the HCP and ESA. So, and I think we're going to start with a series of biological questions. We're not going to be identifying questioners, but and I'll just tee this up, and I think either Marty and/or Bridget can answer. First question: why does the frog need extra water all winter? Isn't it hibernating under the snow?
I can take the first shot at it, Bridget, and then you can jump in. The spotted frog is the most aquatic amphibian that we have in the Pacific Northwest. they will leave the water from time to time to move from one water body to another, or certain times a year during their movement, particularly when their wetlands get dried up when they otherwise would have stayed inundated, which is what we see on the Deschutes River sometimes. But they overwinter in the water, in the mud and the decaying vegetation in the bottom of the water. They need probably at least 2 feet of water over them to overwinter. They will move about from time to time. They will forage, but their activity is greatly reduced, but they do remain in the water. So if they're under the snow, it's snow that's on top of ice that's on top of water. They're not up in the terrestrial area, so.
Right, and they don't hibernate. It's not a hibernation period for them.
Yeah.
You go into a very low energy expenditure period, but they do not hibernate.
I'll just keep ticking through these questions. Like I say, there are quite a few, but if there's any other questions as we go, please raise your hand and we'll take them. Next question, in a dry year like last year, would it be better for the frog to release less water in the winter so it can have more in the summer?
It's a balancing act. If there were a lot of water, it would be great to have more in the summer. But given the year that we had, there's so little available in the winter. I mean, the winter flows, as David mentioned earlier, are pretty low already. It's really an incremental increase toward the ultimate goal for the Deschutes River. So the negative impact of reducing the winter flow outweighs the potential benefit of having more flow in the summer right now. The ultimate goal is to balance out that seasonal fluctuation. But this first 7-year period, we looked at a lot of different options for flows summer and winter, and this one worked out to be the best balance to get started. So, and I'll point out that because we started with a fairly low flow in the winter, the long-term target is higher, and we had a lot of discussion on why can't we be there now. Fish and Wildlife got a lot of comments from environmental groups. Why can't we get to a higher flow now? And because of the provisions in the Endangered Species Act that allow us to look at the economic impact, it's called the practicability threshold. And because of this concern with summer and winter flows, we tried to temper all that, but we all recognize that we're starting out at a fairly low flow. Well, part of the assurance that Fish and Wildlife needed in order to meet the issuance criteria was, if we start out with that low flow, we can't go any lower. We've got to guarantee that floor, because if we start out low and then we can go even lower, they'd get sued almost immediately and we'd be back in federal court defending the HCP. So while it may seem like there's benefits to be made by reducing the winter flows now, there really just isn't the room within the biology of the species or with the issuance criteria for an incidental take permit. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Bridget.
Yeah, I think that was all very well said, Marty. Thank you. I guess the only thing I would just add was kind of building on what Marty said about the spotted frog being our most aquatic amphibian and how it is so reliant on water all year long. And so it really is just this balancing and shaping of the flows to ensure that it has water at each of the different life history stages to ensure it can, feed, breed, and survive. And so there's essential flows and we'll come to this later, but there's essential flows at the breeding period. There's essential flows in the migration period. There's essential flows in the overwintering period. And you can't just sort of trade one for another, because the species has to make it through the entire year to be able to obviously survive and breed and keep and to perpetuate the species. So we looked very carefully at how low we could go at different periods to try to, I'll say shape or squeeze that, available supply as best we can. And certainly last summer with the drought and, conditions right now aren't looking great for this year. We're making some really hard choices on that. But Marty's right. We really went as low as we could to start.
So the next question in kind of a series of these questions along the same theme, is there a way with the HCP, if it is a wet spring, to release less water in April so we can build up the reservoir since no one will be needing the water until later in the year in such a case.
Yeah, and that's actually already built into the HCP. So what happens in late March, early April is that's the time of year when the frogs start to breed. And there are a number of wetlands along the Deschutes River that go dry in the winter because of the flow reduction. Even at 100 CFS, most of those wetlands are still dry. And they do get wet later in the year, and that's where frogs will breed. And in years when the demand, historically, in years where the demand was early and the water came up early or there was a lot of local runoff, the frogs were successful at breeding in those. But those years were kind of few and far between. So part of the HCP effort here is to bring the water up earlier in the spring so it's there for those breeding frogs. That time period when their eggs are in the water and the young tadpoles are in the water, they're really the most sensitive to the amount of water and the fluctuation of the water. So the HCP has provisions to bring the water up at the beginning of April so that it's there for the frogs to breed. But there's also a provision in there that says if it's a cold winter or late winter and the frogs haven't started breeding yet, we can postpone that ramp up. And because they vary the time of breeding based on weather. And actually, I think it's both of the past 2 years, if I'm not mistaken, Bridget, we've delayed that a week or two to conserve that water and wait. And last year, I know we delayed it, brought it up slower. And then we were like a week into the season when we realized the live flow in the river was so low that the demand for irrigation water peaked, and we kind of blew right past our April flow target and the minimum required, and started releasing even more for irrigation. So there was actually a pretty brief period in our last year where there was water being released that wasn't for irrigation, and that provision in the HCP that actually came at the suggestion of the services, that they said, if we can watch that timing, and if they're not breeding, we don't need to put the water there yet. So that's worked out really well.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. I'll add that we are mostly aware, I would say, of the breeding locations. Obviously, we always hope to find frogs breeding in locations that we haven't discovered yet, but their unique habitat requirements sort of lend themselves to very specific geographies. And so we watch those areas and evaluate what the conditions are like. And as Marty said, the last couple of years, it's been a late winter where we've had snow on the ground, which is not conducive to spotted frog breeding. So the question about, is there a way to release less in April? Yes, there is, and we've been doing it for the last couple of years. So, and we wrote many of those provisions in knowing every water year is a different water year and trying to allow ourselves that flexibility of optimizing the conditions for irrigation while maintaining the minimum flow necessary for the species.
Next question, kind of the last in this series, is bottom line, can the HCP be adjusted as needed depending on the weather conditions? And I assume this question is aimed a little bit more at just the ramp up.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand. I don't have them in front of me here. What was that last question?
I can jump in and start on this one, Marty. It basically says, can the HCP be adjusted as needed depending on the weather conditions? And I would say the answer to that is yes. As we just described, the breeding flows have adaptive management elements built into them. And many of the other different periods of the time have adaptive management built in as well to allow for those different weather conditions. I'll say, in the years of negotiating the HCP, it seemed like we had one of every kind of year. So wet spring, cold spring, dry spring, heavy winter, light winter, et cetera. So we got a good look at what the different types of water years were, as well as building off the Bureau of Reclamation's water modeling and looking forward in a drier climate that we might be in the future. So we very much did build that into the plan. Now there's certain sideboards on that. You can't just go completely outside of the plan. It allows for a certain amount of deviation, but it doesn't allow you to completely just miss a target entirely or just not address a particular life stage, kind of like I said earlier. like all animals, you have to take care of every stage in its life history. Otherwise, it can't survive to the next one. And Marty, I don't know if you want to add more about, adjustments to the HCP based on weather, but that's kind of the focus of this question.
Yeah, no, I think that spring adjustment is the main one, the key one that we have. Yeah.
Seeing no hands, going to move on to the next kind of set of questions, and some of these questions have multiple subparts to them, so we'll kind of just break them up as we go. First question on this list is, who did the negotiations for the incremental increases in water for the frog? Why did the HCP support such a drastic increase in water release instead of increasing by smaller increments? Please cite scientific resources that determined what levels would be the optimum levels for survival and increasing the population of the frog, with a note that the search of the references used didn't answer this question. So I'll take the first part. Who did the negotiations for the incremental increases in water for the frog? All of the negotiations on behalf of North Unit were led by the district manager with assistance from legal staff, including me, Marty as biologist. There were other sub-consultants to Marty with expertise in water quality and otherwise. And as I mentioned before, this was not kind of an overnight cut the deal and run sort of thing. It was years in the making, and quite frankly, the negotiations and the modeling of the various scenarios took the last couple, 3 years. So I don't know if, Marty, you want to add to that? It's probably not a question for Bridget so much, but just in terms of negotiating the increases, maybe to jump into the substance, why did the HCP support such a drastic increase in water release instead of increasing the by smaller increments, and the science to support that?
Yeah, actually, I think as we already mentioned, the increase that we're seeing right now, the winter release of 100 CFS is actually not drastic. It's actually pretty small. Without Wikia Reservoir there, the winter flow in the Deschutes River, it varies by water year, obviously, but it'd be probably somewhere between 500 and 600 CFS. And in the summer, it would be somewhere between 600 and 700 CFS, right below Wikia Dam. Then it picks up flow as it gets further downstream. Historically, the way Wikia Dam operated, actually before, 15, 20 years ago, they could dry the river up completely below the dam. And then in the summer, when they're releasing water to be conveyed downstream for diversion, it could be well over 1,000 CFS. And that shift in the hydrology of the river is what really has altered and impacted those wetlands where the frogs would be present. So the goal under the HCP is to try and get that hydrology back toward the natural regime. It'll never be back to the original hydrologic regime, although as Dave mentioned earlier, one of the lawsuits that was filed in 2016 was that they wanted to see the river back to the natural hydrology, which would pretty much eliminate storage for irrigation in Wikia Reservoir. The service recognized early on that's not practicable, which was one of the standards for the issuance of an ITP, but we need to get as close to that as we can. So there are incremental steps in those winter releases, but the current one up to the 100 CFS for this first 7 years is actually a pretty small increase from the roughly 21 CFS that you could otherwise be required up to the 100 CFS. It's a pretty small increase. And what it's based on, the two studies that are cited in Chapter 8 of the HCP, one was done in support of the biological opinion that was done at the settlement agreement for that lawsuit back in 2016 required Fish and Wildlife Service to issue temporary incidental take. The biological opinion that they had to prepare, the documentation they had to prepare in support of that included a number of habitat studies they did. One of them was the one where they looked at the various wetlands where they know frogs are present, and they looked at the flows in the river, and they identified what are the minimum flows necessary to support those wetlands. And because they're on gradual plateaus, basically, as you move up out of the river channel, it's pretty distinct when the water starts to enter those. We actually did some more studies on that this year during the ramp up. And so the current flow, the 100 CFS, doesn't really even get into any of those wetlands. So those studies showed that we need more like 300 CFS at least to get into some of those. And by breeding time, more like 900 CFS. And so there's a number of things that are going to need to go on. Some habitat improvements in the channel to make less water go further. And there's the time that the services have allowed North Unit to come up with alternate sources of water. So you can't release these near flows. But that study that Fish and Wildlife Service did, and then a similar study that was done by a river design group in support of the basin study that was done over the past several years, both looked at the relationship between flow in the river and the inundated area of those wetlands. And it's pretty straightforward how much water you need to get into them.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. I'll just add on that. Yeah, that's our 2014 ramp down study. That's how we refer to that. That's an appendix to the 2017 biological opinion, which was cited as a whole citation for the 2020 analysis for issuing the permit. And as Marty said, we work very closely with the Oregon Water Resources Department and the irrigation districts. And as the flows were being ramped down, they were held for periods of time to allow a correlation between how much water was coming out of the gauge versus what the inundation was in the wetlands. So we have a very good understanding for where frogs are, where they breed, where they overwinter, about what the specific flow is out of Wikia reservoir versus what we see in the wetlands. So that correlation is what we made our determination on. And those flows were based on that, primarily on that series of studies. The other part of this about why not have incremental increases. We were clear from the Fish and Wildlife Service perspective that increases should be made that have a biological benefit. We took actually a lot of, we had a lot of questions, I should say, from members of the environmental community saying, why don't you go from 100 to 150 to 200 to 250? And as Marty said, it's really it's not until you get about 300 that you actually have a biological benefit to spotted frog below Wikia. And so rather than have winter flows increase incrementally that didn't provide biological benefit, we wanted to allow the districts to use that time to continue the piping and launch the water bank, start getting used to a change in water management that would allow for it hitting these higher flows over time.
And one thing I might add, a lot of people have asked, when we were going through the environmental review process, why do 100 now? Why don't just wait a while and go straight to 300 later on? And the 100 CFS actually does have a benefit. It's small, it's not the ultimate target, but what it does is it wets up the majority of the main river channel, which does provide some habitat. Particularly at 100 CFS, that water is moving fairly slowly, and it starts to look like spotted frog overwintering habitat. It's far from ideal, but it is an incremental improvement over what we had before. So we felt it was worth implementing that first phase, just so otherwise, the service would in effect be waiting 8 years to see any benefit from the HCP. And I don't think they could defend that in the face of a lawsuit.
Right, it also starts to help restore the aquatic food web and just the entire aquatic ecology of the area that historically in the winter when the river was shut off, everything dies. That's why there's a fish rescue every year. And frankly, that fish rescue only occurs close to Bend because people see that. There's likely fish kills further up the river when the river gets shut down like that. So moving from the historical 20 to the 100 CFS starts to reestablish that aquatic food web, which allows for future prey for the spotted frog and just the entire aquatic ecology coming back to life. Instead of having an on-off system, the goal is to try to allow that to have year-round, to survive year-round.
So the question is, from a legal standpoint, does the ESA require the system to be returned to a natural state? And the answer is no. And certainly the HCP does not do that. It makes a step towards that, but it does not do that. I would also say that we've been very straightforward that the HCP is really designed to address irrigation-related impacts from the districts as well as the bureaus, under the Section 7. the Bureau's operations and decision-making that it has to do. There are a number of other issues and problems that the districts don't have anything to do with, whether that's habitat improvement or deterioration that occurs on Forest Service lands, wherever that might be, and that's not for us to fix, or that's somebody else's problem. I'm not sure if you can hear the question online, but the question is, why can't we use the 100 CFS and maybe a little in-water work and get that water up into some of the tributaries to create habitat year-round?
Yeah, I think there's probably a few things go in there to talk about. To physically engineer the river to make that 100 CFS support those wetlands, it would make the HCP look pretty cheap by the time you got done doing that. I mean, that would be a heroic effort. The other thing, in general, there's always the temptation to think about, well, couldn't we get into some kind of artificial propagation or create some man-made habitats where the frogs can breed and that sort of thing. And there's really two reasons we don't normally do that in an HCP. One is that the natural habitat is always going to be, there's so much we don't understand about habitat that if we try to create it, we'll find out how much we don't know. It's always better to work if you can restore or maintain the natural habitat that the frogs are already using. There's just too many hurdles to creating artificial habitat. And the second reason, which is kind of related to that, is the cost of doing that, again, would dwarf what the HCP is costing. To take on the responsibility for propagating habitat for the next 30 years, it's just not something that an HCP or an incidental take permit holder would really want to get involved in. And that's what it would mean. It would mean that the districts would be responsible for producing a certain number of frogs each year and providing the habitat. And it would be a heroic effort.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that, just as a reminder, it's approximately 60 miles from Wikia to Bend, and there are habitats, perch habitats and wetland habitats all along those 60 miles. And while, I would agree there are certain areas that we think maybe a little engineering could help hold water a little bit better, Marty's absolutely right. We've tinkered in places in the past, and we've been humbled by the lack of our understanding of what that actually does. Now, having said that, there are places on the Deschutes where going forward, as we start to increase the flows, that we might do some of that. We might put a beaver dam analog in an area to help hold water to allow for certain depths to occur at different flows. That might occur, but just kind of getting out there and wanting to pump water into an area or impound it generally has typically has unintended consequences. And then I'll just finally add that segment of the river is designated as a wild and scenic river by the U.S. Forest Service. And they're not going to take kindly to us showing up with our, backhoes and devices to impound water in a way that they might not find valuable.
Yeah, the question was, doesn't the Endangered Species Act trump the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act? And I'll just say it doesn't really work like that. Do you have any comment on that, Bridget?
We try not to debate which federal law actually trumps one another, but I would say if the Forest Service thought that would be beneficial and they brought those projects to us, we'd have to reconcile both of those acts together. So it's not so much that one trumps one another, it's really a matter of how you reconcile them. Same as with the Clean Water Act and other environmental laws.
And I think the Forest Service would have to look at proposals on a case-by-case basis. So a lot of the goals for the Upper Deschutes Habitat Conservation Fund are really to restore natural habitats along the river that have been degraded because of the history of the storage and release of water. They would look at that differently from going out and creating artificial habitats in that wild and scenic corridor. The former would probably be applauded, the latter would probably be opposed.
Yeah, and actually, if I can get to the next question, I think it kind of gets into the same theme, which is what has actively been done in conjunction with increasing irrigation flow to remove predators, i.e. the bullfrog, and improve other factors for frog survival. And then the questioner cited to pages 8 and 9 of the incidental take permit, which goes into the use of the Upper Deschutes Conservation Fund to be used for predator control projects like bullfrog removal, removal of encroaching invasive plants to open and expand habitats, and kind of goes from there. So I think part of the question is, as the flow is going up, what are we doing about it? Or what else are we doing, and how's the fund being used? And
I'm going to let Bridget answer that, but before she does, I want to help her out here a little bit and point out that all of those things are not a replacement for providing the habitat with the flows under the HCP. There are things that are necessary in addition to the flows to make it all work, and that's why the districts are providing the funding for that. It was either that or commit to all those actions within the HCP, and we all mutually agreed that it was better to not make all of those actions a liability for the permittees, but rather to just provide the funding and the service, and the state can direct that. So, Bridget.
Thanks, Marty. Yes, one of the measures, and it's part of the rationale for that, is cited in the question that is for the expenditure of funds from the Upper Deschutes Conservation Fund. So there's a HDP conservation measure that requires payment of $150,000 per year into this Upper Deschutes Conservation Fund. That fund is held by the Oregon Community Foundation, and funds from that are used to address all of the threats to the spotted frog. That first payment was submitted in this last year. The Oregon Community Foundation has a very detailed process on how funds get used out of that fund. There's an advisory committee and a technical committee that we convened that includes the Forest Service, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Geological Survey, and I think that's it. Those are the technical experts at this time. And in the first year, the first expenditure of funds was occurred. A $50,000 grant was distributed to the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, and the Watershed Council then contracted for bullfrog removal in very specific areas along the Little Deschutes where previous work had occurred. So that work is underway right now, and that will continue. Sorry, just a little bit of that. The agreement with Watershed Council goes through the fall of this year to maintain, to continue to move home frogs, which are a threat to spotted frogs. Now we're looking at other expenditures out of that fund as well, possibly with trying to remove invasive fish out of Crater Prairie this year. So each year, expenditures will be made to address the other threats.
Oh, I just want to reiterate, it's not like we got toward the end of the HCP and the district said, you know, we have this other 150 grand laying around. Can you use that too? All of those things that will be funded with that measure were all items that were brought up during the 12 years of negotiation. Well, maybe you could do this, maybe you could do that, because it all falls under that category of minimize and mitigate the effects of your take. Sometimes the mitigation is not directed for the action you're doing, but it's something that benefits the species in compensation for the impact that you're having. So all of those things were out there as potential measures to put in the HCP. We tried very hard to keep the HCP focused on things that districts can control. You can control turning on and turning off the water, but hiring somebody to go out and kill bullfrogs or to eradicate reed canary grass, those are very difficult things to do, and they're things that districts just really don't want to take on. So we agreed with the service that the districts would provide the funding, and to a large extent, they'll use that as seed money or matching money to be able to even expand what they have available, because whenever they get going on those things, that 150,000 isn't going to go all that far. But the only obligation the districts have is to provide that 150,000. The service in the state and the foundation that's managing it will take on the responsibility from there.
So just to restate, in case some of that was missed, we have spent money already to initiate contracts to control bullfrogs. That work is underway and will continue this year and likely will continue for many years. We are then moving on to other species, invasive fish and other predators all across the range of the spotted frog, all across the range in the Deschutes for the spotted frog to address the other threats that, that would also impact its ability to survive.
Question is, how many bullfrogs have been killed so far?
I'm sorry, I don't know that, but there are obligations within the contract for reporting, and I will be happy to post and share that report when we get it.
Another question?
It's a pretty incredible process, though, I will say. The folks go out at night and capture those bullfrogs, and it's amazing. One bullfrog can eat so many spotted frogs. So we do know also, just to give a little more science to it, Sun River has an agreement with us, a little different than the HCP, but they have an agreement with us on habitat management. And as part of that plan, they have been controlling bullfrogs for many years. And there was a turnover in their staff, and there was about a year or two where that activity did not occur. And the bullfrog numbers took off, spotted frog numbers went down. When we reinstituted the program to get the bullfrog control active again, spotted frog numbers came back up and bullfrog numbers went down. So we know it's an effective mechanism to reduce a pretty voracious predator in the same habitats.
Bridget, when will you have the documents ready?
The documents to
The data on the bullfrog report.
I'll have to check the Conservation Fund grant specifically. I don't recall. I think the report was likely due at the end of the project, which would be in the fall of this year. But I'm happy to see if I can get an interim report, at least to understand where things are at, and I can send that to Josh or others at NUID.
I'm impressed that you got that going so quickly. In the written response to that comment, I noted that you just got your first round of funding middle of last year. So I'm impressed that you actually got something funded on the ground that quickly.
Thank you. It was sort of fast moving for us, and we were happy to get it going. We didn't want to lose any time. We wanted to get get going on it right away.
Got a couple more questions up front first. A question, should Sun River be liable to the water users for the damage that their bullfrogs did to the spotted frog? I guess I would ask maybe just change it just a little bit to say, what's the Fish and Wildlife Service doing with respect to others who may be contributing to take in one fashion or another?
Yeah, that's, I would say, to try to maybe directly answer the first part of that, I would presume that the folks that live adjacent to Sun River might not consider them their bullfrogs. Bullfrogs are an invasive species. They were brought here, I believe, in the 1920s as a food source for people. And I know I don't have that history totally dialed, but they were brought here deliberately, and they have then spread all across Oregon and pretty much wreak havoc on our aquatic systems. We have an agreement with Sun River on that management of those frogs because they were excluded from critical habitat. That's a whole other portion of the Endangered Species Act. I'm happy to go into it, but Sun River itself does not have liability for predators that are in the waterways that they didn't put there. And then regarding David's sort of add on to the question, what are we doing with other entities? We actually are in the process right now of working with BLM, Bureau of Land Management, as well as a number of private landowners, including Sun River, including Bend Parks and Rec Department, on setting up a corollary program, which is called a Safe Harbor Agreement, which addresses other management activities that can harm frogs. So we're working, now that we have the HCP in place, we're now moving on and working with all of the other landowners, land managers, anybody else who can have an impact on spotted frogs to evaluate what actions they can do to also minimize their threats or minimize their impacts and do things to conserve the species, like removal of reed canary grass, removal of bullfrogs, et cetera. So we are working with those other landowners to do that and are likely going to be setting up a programmatic safe harbor to do that.
The statement
I
was,
couldn't hear the second part of it.
the statement or question was the Oregon spotted frog is not native either.
Oregon spotted frog is native to Oregon, absolutely. No question.
Are they anywhere else in the United
Oregon
States?
spotted frog, yeah, sorry, I can hear some of those, yeah. The Oregon spotted frog is found currently basically from the Klamath Basin up to southern British Columbia. Historically, they were found a lot further south and over on the west side in a lot of wetlands in that area as well. But they are now, their range has shrunk, but they are native to this area, 100% certain on that, and found basically from the Klamath Basin to southern British Columbia.
The question is, why are they listed as threatened then if there are other populations elsewhere?
Species get listed as threatened because there are, get put on the endangered species list when there are threats to their continued existence. Marty referenced earlier a little bit about our rigorous scientific process. The way we do any kind of listings, we evaluate the abundance of the species, the threats to their long-term persistence, the likelihood that other regulatory mechanisms might protect them already, whether that's state law or other laws that might allow for their conservation. And then we evaluate if putting them on the endangered species list would address those threats and allow for the species to recover, or if there would be no difference from putting them on the endangered species list. So while we have them in different areas, they're all in very small, or those populations have shrunk and the threats to their continued reduction continue. So when we looked at whether to put the frog on the list, we were looking at were the populations going up, were they steady, or were they going down? And in all areas, the populations of spotted frogs were going down as a result of the ongoing threats. Primary threat was water management activities, which removed water from frog habitat that they need to survive.
Yeah, there are populations or there are frogs from the Klamath Basin clear up to the Sumas drainage in northern Washington, southern British Columbia. But they're all pretty small and fragmented and isolated from each other. And they're in areas that are vulnerable to continued destruction, a lot of agricultural areas. At one time, there were quite a few in the Willamette Basin, but they're very small numbers over there now. So it sounds like it might sound like there's a lot when you say they're from Klamath to British Columbia, but they're pretty scattered and spread out throughout there.
And disconnected.
And yeah, exactly.
The question was,
Didn't quite catch that.
the question was, you said that they were on the west side of the mountain, and would any of that be due to urbanization around Salem and Portland?
Absolutely. There's loss of wetlands all over the whole, the west side that likely led to the extirpation of those sites, meaning those species, that frogs are gone in most of those areas. The only area we really have frogs on the west side right now are up in the high lakes, right over the crest of the Cascades. So yes, many of those areas, that was the result of development, that those populations were long gone by the time the Endangered Species Act came into effect.
To paraphrase, what is being done in other basins between here and Canada? And part of the question was, I guess, and we can't tell Canada what to do, but what other efforts or maybe the service undertaking that are beyond the focus and the scrutiny here in the Deschutes Basin?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. So our office is the lead office for the Fish and Wildlife Service across the range of the spotted frog, and we're in the process right now of developing the spotted frog recovery plan. And when we do a recovery plan, we evaluate what the current condition is in each of the areas that the species exists, and then we start to design strategies to enhance their populations. So we're right now working with all our partners across the range of the frog to identify what kind of actions we can embark upon. I know up in Washington State, They've done a number of habitat restoration projects north of Seattle to reconnect areas similar to what we've done in the Deschutes about ensuring water is available all year long. There's been a number of habitat restoration projects up in the Whatcom County area north of Seattle to reestablish connection. We actually are also in contact with the Canadian government. We just recently met with them in the last few weeks to ensure that when we develop our recovery plan, we're citing what types of activities they've done and trying to understand whether those are effective. And one of the things we've learned from the Canadians that they have, part of their area is so depleted from frogs that they've actually started active propagation. And that may be something we end up having to do here. We hope not. That's where you artificially, like, you either raise them in a zoo or you raise them in a hatchery, if you will, or you move them from one location to another. That's called translocation. We may find that that might be beneficial at some point here too. We are fortunate that we have some areas that Deschutes is the stronghold of the population, despite its continued decline. The frogs have declined since we listed them in 2014 in this basin. And so despite that, the early measures that came out of the settlement agreement and some of the measures that were then adopted into the HCP about sustaining the level at Crane Prairie, we've seen positive response from spotted frogs there. Down the road, that may become a population. So we have different threats, different areas, and we have different strategies in those areas to identify and deliver recovery.
And just point out, artificial propagation is really just an intermediate measure. You still have to have habitat to put those animals out into. Exactly what's happening with the steelhead in the Deschutes Basin, where they're taking hatchery stock and using them to reintroduce a native run in the upper Deschutes or in the Crooked River in the Tolius. And so artificial propagation isn't, you couldn't perpetuate a listed species through artificial propagation the way people breed game birds and then release them for breeding. You have to have habitat. The long-term goal has to be getting them in the habitat, otherwise you won't succeed.
Any other questions? If not, we've got just a few more minutes, and we've got a couple, I think, really important questions I want to make. Oh, there's one in the back. Go ahead. So I think that's Phil. I don't have my glasses on. Phil with North Unit has a question about last year, the district came under a lot of scrutiny for how water, the management regime, kind of mid to late season, and wanted your comments about how that regime either worked or I guess didn't for frogs, and how that, what your view of the first year of implementation of the HCP might be. Did I catch it, Phil? You said close enough.
Okay, I'll give that a try. And hi, Phil. I'm sorry I'm not there with you, but as we entered into last summer and recognized pretty early on how dry of a spring that we had and the reduction in live flow, it became pretty apparent to us early on that we would need to stretch the existing water supply to ensure that we would retain water in the spotted frog habitats where the frogs had bred. So we have those locations identified. We know how long it takes for a tadpole to develop, and so we were trying to correlate the inundation of those areas with the use of the irrigation water as you all were calling for it. Now, we're fortunate, and I'm sure it doesn't feel this way, but we are actually fortunate in that the spotted frogs that North Unit has the most impact on are between Wikia and your diversion. And so in the summer, when water is released for irrigation, it also wets up the spotted frog habitat. So our goal all last summer, knowing that we didn't have sufficient supply, clearly not sufficient supply for irrigation uses, nor did we have sufficient supply to wet up the frog habitat the way we would want to. And so we met with leadership from North Unit and Water Resources and all our experts, and tried to shape that water to sustain the water in the frog habitat next to the river while you were releasing water and diverting for irrigation. So that was a very challenging year. I'm sure it was more challenging for those of you trying to grow crops with highly limited supply. It was a very challenging year. I will say I report the coordination on how we implemented the HCP as one of the real benefits of the HCP, in that we were meeting. I think I was, getting text messages or, cell phones ringing off the hook for, multiple times a week, multiple times a day, to try to stay in close contact to ensure that we were trying to inform the release of that water to provide the best conservation possible with the limited supply we had. So that took hours of planning and field surveys to evaluate conditions. But it was very challenging. I don't know, Mara, you want to add anything to that?
No. I was calling you several times a day trying to wear you out, but I didn't succeed.
What rationale was used to finalize the HCP, knowing that North Unit would be the hardest hit economically and could be at risk of having to switch to dryland farming? It is stated several times in the HCP summary that North Unit will potentially suffer the greatest agricultural losses versus the other districts involved in the HCP. And then in parentheses, it says, I would like this answered by the attorney, which is me. And I will just say that there is a biological basis and a legal basis. From a legal standpoint, North Unit has the most junior water rights in the basin. And so when live flow runs short, North Unit gets turned off first, and that's been kind of the run of the river for the last, ever since North Unit came into existence. And so from a very starting point, North Unit's a little bit at the mercy of not only the weather, drought, but also of the other districts. On the science side of it, part of the reason I would say that North Unit incurs proportionately higher costs than some of the other permittees is because North Unit has by far the greatest impact on Oregon spotted frogs as compared to all of the other districts. And quite frankly, the one point I wanted to make is that all of my work, Marty's work, and others, it was done on behalf of not just North Unit, but all of the irrigators and the districts in the basin, along with the city of Prineville. And part of the reason we structured it up that way from the very beginning was that we had more strength in numbers and quite frankly, more opportunities. If North Unit were left to fix its own problems on its own, I don't think we would have ever gotten there. And so part of the thinking behind the HCP is that yes, North Unit is giving up a greater percentage of its supply vis-a-vis Wikia, but it's also getting the advantage of the conservation that the other districts are doing to replace that supply. And it's why we built the 7+ years, and I can go into the plus after we're done here if somebody's interested in that. But it was to give time to replace the water. If we didn't have the HCP and we were on our own, we'd be right back in court fighting the same preliminary injunction I talked about earlier without any sort of a period to be made whole. And before we could say we were working on the HCP and we wouldn't have that defense. And quite frankly, I don't think we'd have the support of the Fish and Wildlife Service or the tribes, and certainly not the environmental group. So yeah, go ahead, Marty.
Can I add something to what you just said?
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, to be specific on the relationship between North Unit and the other districts and the costs, Crane Prairie Reservoir has spotted frogs in it. And that's where Central Oregon, Arnold, and Lone Pine store their water. And actually now, through some recent agreements, there's a little bit of North Unit water stored there as well. That Crane Prairie has a storage capacity of 50,000 acre-feet. Under the HCP, on an annual basis, to protect frogs, we've dramatically reduced the fluctuation in the reservoir to the point where there's only 10,000 acre-feet available annually, 20% of what the capacity of that reservoir. And certain years, like this past year where it's extremely dry, there's another 5,000 available, but that's kind of a limited thing. So they have reduced the storage capacity of their reservoir permanently by at least to 20% of what they had before. Wikia Reservoir stores 200,000 acre-feet. And when there's a good water year, all of it's available for North Unit to use. There's no increment in there that's of that fluctuation that is reserved for frogs. You can use the full 200,000 acre-feet as long as we meet those other flow requirements. It's just because of this drought situation that we're in, where everything's kind of coming to a head. But in terms of over the long term, the other districts actually gave up a much larger percentage of their storage. I guess part of the reason that it's impacting North Unit is because you rely more heavily on storage because of your junior water right. If this exchange proceeds the way that they're hoping with COID piping and transferring water to North Unit, you'll actually pick up live flow, natural flow in the river, which is better than storage any day. So over the long term, if everybody stays on track, I think you'll come out ahead.
The question is, why don't they fix the river so the problem goes away? Meaning, the question is really about the fact that so much work, I think, has been done to straighten, widen, maybe put in berms and do other things to the river, maybe for flood control purposes or otherwise. If we could re-meander the river and return it to more of a natural state, then maybe we don't need as much flow. Is that between woody debris additions and whatnot? Is that an option? Yeah, big boulders, anything to do to bring the water level up like it was 40 years ago.
I think I got that. I'll take a stab at it, and Marty, you can help me out here. But basically, since Wikia was built and the flow regime changed from its natural flow to a system of storage in the winter and release in the summer, the whole upper portion of the river has been altered. When the flow is really low in the winter, the sides of the river it goes through a freeze and thaw cycle, and a lot of that sediment starts to slough off. And then in the summer, when we go into irrigation delivery mode and those flows go up super high, that scoured the whole upper portion of the river. So the upper portion of the Deschutes River has embankments that are 20, 40 feet straight up with tree roots sticking sideways out of the river. Those areas are going to take a long time to heal. That's not something you can just come in and put some large boulders in. Now, the sinuosity, that natural curviness, we like that too. In some areas, because of the high flows, those areas that were more, I'll say S-shaped and meandering, those high flows cut through that, and you have more of a channelization that goes through that. So part of our goal, at least from when we brought to the table in our side of the negotiation, was trying to get back to sort of mimicking, not going all the way back to a natural state, but trying to mimic more of a natural state where instead of having really low flows in the winter that dried up the river and then high flows in the summer that scoured away. So we're trying to rebalance the system so that it has more of a natural flow, and then you'll have the vegetation either actively by us planting it using that conservation fund, or passively just through the lack of it being scoured away every summer or inundated to such an extent where it can't grow if it's underwater. So we agree that having more meandering in the river would be better. That allows for more inundation, but that's a slow process, and that's not something we can just immediately come in and engineer. Kind of back to that whole issue with the wild and scenic river and unintended consequences. I don't know if Marty, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just briefly. Bridget's right. I mean, all that stream restoration needs to be done, and the conservation fund will help fund part of that. But it's not a substitute for rebalancing the hydrologic regime. It's something that needs to occur in conjunction with it. You really need both parts. And so if we were going to try and make this work without any stream restoration, it would probably take considerably more water than we're currently committing under the HEP or even have available. There physically isn't enough to do it. But the stream restoration isn't going to replace the need to balance the hydrology. They really both go hand in hand.
Yeah, all of the above kind of plan.
So very quickly then, the three questions are, with all the sacrifice last year that the North Unit farmers made, did it do any good for the frog? How are they doing? The second question is will they ever have enough? Are we ever going to be able to satisfy the frog's needs? And the third question is on the track we're on, is there a time at which Wikia will become obsolete? I think the first two questions are probably maybe for you, Bridget.
Yeah, so it was a very, very challenging year last year, not just for water users, but for all aquatic life across the entire West Coast. Fish, frogs, all types of wildlife suffered during a drought. So we don't look, we survey the frogs during their breeding period because that's the time we know where they are and we can get a reliable count each year. So we will be surveying them again in April. We look at multiple years of data to evaluate a trend. So it's hard to say whether 1 year of a certain strategy actually makes a difference or not. Now, like the irrigators, frogs did not get the water they needed last year. So they were similarly, we were doing the best we can to allow for the maximum number of them to survive, to grow, to be able to breed and produce young in the future. But it was not a great year for spotted frogs either. And what was the second question? I'm sorry.
Will we ever do enough
will they ever get enough?
Satisfy the?
Yeah, sorry. So we design, as we brought again so our job is to speak for the needs of the species in the negotiation and understanding what the needs of the water users were. The flow volumes at different times at all of the gauges across the HCP are designed to meet the needs of the spotted frog so that they can be on a trajectory to recovery. So yes, there will be enough if the HCP is implemented as designed.
So in 30 years, this could all go away.
I mean, to be honest, genuinely, if we implement this HCP and all of the other conservation, the water, the efficiencies that I refer to as just the irrigation modernization, if that all occurs and the new flow regime is implemented, my hope is that we recover the frog, we delist it, and that there's not a need for anything beyond this 30-year plan, that we are in a new water management regime that addresses the needs of the species and yet delivers water in a much more efficient manner to water users. And we've, as I think Dave said earlier, we've solved our own problems here in the basin. Yeah.
Dave, was part of that question, will Wikia become obsolete?
That was part 3, yes.
Yeah. You may get a number of opinions on this, but my personal opinion is no, it never will be. Because of the way that the river has been modified, like we talked earlier, there are wetlands that are used in the summer for breeding that simply won't get water under a natural flow regime. They'll get closer with the work that'll be done in the river, but there's probably still going to be some where we have to release more water in the summer than you would normally see in a natural flow just to get those wetlands wetted up. And you'll need storage in the reservoir to do that. And concurrent with releasing it for frogs, it'll be available for irrigation. So I don't think Wikia Reservoir is going anywhere. But I did want to touch real briefly on one other thing too, because maybe we said this already a number of times today. The first year of HCP implementation coincided with a historic drought. And so it makes it look like the HCP is causing the problems on North Unit. It's contributing to them, there's no doubt about that, but it is a small contributor. We actually started, as a result of the settlement agreement and the lawsuit that Dave referred to earlier, we started releasing 100 CFS all winter long back in the fall of 2016. In the spring of 2017, the reservoir got to 174,000 acre feet. The following year, with that 100 CFS release in the winter, the reservoir filled. It's really just because then we got into this drought cycle where there's not much water available. And because we had to guarantee minimum flow in order to get the HCP approved, that the 100 CFS is still in place, and it's reducing your available storage by around 29,000 acre feet this year. But the majority of the problem in North Unit is there's a drought, and North Unit's a junior water right on the system. I mean, it's a tough situation, but that's the reality of it.
Yeah, and David, if I could, I saw there was one other question about why the HCP draft wasn't released. And I just wanted to clarify that it was released for public comment. We had public meetings that I was on KTVZ and several news channel, TV channels. It was in every newspaper in the basin as a requirement of the publication of the document. We had a 45-day comment period on that draft. We received over 1,500 written comments from all members of all communities. And so I just wanted to be clear that the draft was released for public comment prior to its completion as a final draft, which was then published again for a waiting period to evaluate whether it did meet the criteria. So it had two periods when it was publicly available prior to it being adopted.